because, there we go, my phone was blurry. So we'll try this, and if this doesn't work, then I'm just going to throw in the towel with recording them, but it is what it is. Anyways, so with histology, we're going to start sticking these cells together, right? I know most of you are super excited to get into bones and muscles and brain stuff, but this is one of the most important, if not even more important than chapter 1 stuff, because this is going to really lay the foundation for that structure-function relationship that we keep talking about. So to get us started, histology is the study of the tissues in the body. Remember that kind of biological organization that we mentioned in chapter 1, where you have molecules creating cells, cells creating tissues, tissues creating organs, organs creating organ systems. So we're starting here with tissues because next week we're going to get into our first body system and learn all the different organs in our first body system. So it's really important that we understand this. Before we can, you have to first understand that there's something called an extracellular matrix, or sometimes it's called interstitial fluid. I'll write the word up here. It's basically the outside of a cell. So we have stuff inside of cells and stuff outside of cells, and stuff inside of tissues and stuff outside of tissues. So extracellular matrix is the outside stuff. Right? It's also sometimes called interstitial fluid. It's the stuff outside of cells / tissues. So there's 4 main tissue types that are in the body, and they're in all multicellular living things. So these 4 tissue types are in mammals, and birds, and fish, and all that. So our tissue types are epithelial. Epithelial tissue is a covering and a lining. So can you name me or think of places in our body that are a covering or a lining? Where would we find epithelial tissue? Our skin, yeah. What else?
The intestines.
Yeah, the inside of the intestines maybe, or the very outside of the intestines. If I had intestines to lay in front of you, here's some intestines, right? You would be looking at the covering of the outside of the intestines, right? You would be looking at the epithelial tissue on the outside of the intestine. If we cut the intestines open and looked inside to kind of where the food passes through, that's also a lining, right? Just like the inside of our mouth is a lining. There's epithelial tissue. The inside of our nose is a lining. That's epithelial tissue, right? So we have epithelial tissue covering and lining everywhere it can in the body. We talked about serous membranes already, right? Parietal pericardium, the peritoneum. Guess what those are made of? Epithelial tissue, right? It's a covering. Coverings and linings. So those serous membranes are epithelial tissues. All right. We also have connective tissues. So the easy answer is, what do? They connect things, right? But not really, because connective tissue is kind of this hodgepodge category of tissues in the body that you wouldn't think are related to each other. Let me give you an example. Bone and blood are both in this category. And so you're probably thinking, how are they similar enough to be classified as connective tissue? And that's because connective tissue has 2 components to it. Epithelial tissue is literally just a covering or a lining. You can think of this as like roof shingles, right? Or like a wall, right? Connective tissue is very different. Connective tissue has cells and other stuff. Non-cells, things that aren't made of cells, fibers and fluid in them. So connective tissues, yes, they connect and they store and they do lots of different things, and we'll look at that. But what makes connective tissues connective tissue is that they have cells and, a really cool word, they have something called a matrix. A matrix is non-cells, right? So this would be like fibers and fluid. fibers and fluid in our connective tissue, not just cells. And so they're there for support, they connect, they transport, they store. We'll go through all the functions as we look at all the different tissues, but I just want to give you a nice overview of them. There's also muscle tissue. So muscle tissue is for contraction. It's specialized for contraction. And by contraction, we literally mean shortening, right? Producing tension. That tension is going to lead to movement, right? That's what our muscle cells are specialized for. You can't contract an epithelial cell. You can't contract a connective tissue cell, right? You can contract a muscle cell. So that's what they're there for. That's what they do. And the last type of tissue is called nervous tissue. This is to send and receive signals. That's what they're specialized for. They're specialized in sending messages, communicating. And so what this chapter mostly focuses on is epithelial and connective tissues, because this is what the majority of your body is made of. When we go through and we learn all the muscles in the muscular system, we'll learn about muscular tissue. And when we start the nervous system and we do the brain and spinal cord, we'll learn about nervous tissue. So this chapter is focused on these two. Right? These two are part of it, muscle and nervous, but the bulk of what we're going to be learning today and Thursday are those two types of tissues. So, let me get this one backwards, and it did. Okay. Let's talk about this concept of a matrix. So a matrix is this extra stuff that's not living. So a matrix is made of fibers, and it's made of fluid. The fibers are called fibers. They're called protein fibers. There's different types of protein fibers. We'll learn about them. But the fluid is called ground substance. So, and this will make more sense once you become familiar with the tissues and look at them, and that's what we're going to do tomorrow night. We'll go through and look at all the different tissues. The whole purpose of this extracellular matrix, or ECM, is to provide some type of structure to allow resistance of force in different directions, and we'll look at that as we go. And so, and it basically holds everything in place. So, the ground substance is the juice, right? The interstitial fluid. This is the extracellular fluid. This is the juice that surrounds the cells. So the ground substance has in it sometimes something called chondroitin sulfate. Have you ever heard of that before? You can buy like little pills of it over the counter to help you with your arthritis or achy joints, right? So these are things that are going to help support the cells on the outside. Right? These help support the cells. They also help support the fibers, right? So this ground substance, which contains chondroitin sulfate, hyaluronic acid, just other ingredients. You don't have to necessarily know the specific names of them. You just need to know that the ground substance isn't just juice, right? There's stuff in it, nutrients there to support the cells and to support the fibers. And so proteoglycans are another ingredient in this ground substance, and this just helps kind of make that ground substance not quite so liquidy, right? Think of the ground substance is somewhere between water and jello in all these tissues, right? So the more stuff, the more of these like protein things that are in there, the thicker that matrix is going to be, the less that are in there, the more watery it's going to be. So kind of it's going to determine what our tissue is going to be like. And this, again, will make a lot more sense once you learn the different types of tissue. This is just an overview of them. There's other ways that our cells can connect to each other. One's called cell adhesion molecules. And so sometimes these are within that ground substance, helping the cells connect to each other or helping the cells connect to other things. And this will, again, just help hold those cells in place so the tissue can maintain its architecture. So if we take a look here, this is what you should picture when you picture a matrix, right? So we mentioned the matrix here in connective tissues. Our epithelial cells don't really have a matrix because they're just covering and lining. But our connective tissues have this framework to them. So here's a cell, right? And then here is this matrix that surrounds the cell. So it's not just juice, right? There's stuff inside of it. All of those big words, the proteoglycans, the cellular adhesion molecules, all of those things are all kind of floating around in there, helping to give it structure, helping to give it viscosity and some type of strength. There's 3 types of fibers that are involved in our connective tissues. So we have collagen fibers, which you've probably heard of before. A lot of skincare products like to talk about collagen. These are fibers in connective tissue. So we have collagen. Collagen is very long and very thick. It's resistant to tension. So think of it like a rope. This is like a rope. So if I had, well, one of the types of connective tissue is a tendon or a ligament, right? Connect bones to bones or muscles to bones, right? And if you think about your muscles pulling on the bones, it's literally like a rope pulling on the bone, right? That rope is made of collagen. And when we look at these under the microscope, you will see those collagen fibers. They're all going in the same direction. It literally looks like a rope. A little lasso, pulling on the bone, relaxing. Collagen acts as a rope. And collagen is in lots of different connective tissues. I'm using ligaments as an example, so you can kind of think of it. But yeah, it's very resistant to tension. It does not stretch easily. It pulls with pressure. There's also elastic fibers. So elastic fibers allow for recoil. So again, a lot of skincare commercials like to talk about elastic fibers or elastin. I'm thinking about like different commercials and products that my friends sell on Facebook or whatever. So collagen and elastic fibers are underneath your skin. To understand collagen, think if I were to pull your skin. You can pull your skin. When you pull your skin out, right, it doesn't really go very far. That's because of the collagen that's resistant to tension, right? The collagen prevents it from just stretching on out, right? Elastic fibers are in my skin. The elastic fibers help it go back down, right? So as we get older, what happens to those collagen and elastic fibers in our skin, and we'll talk about this more in the integumentary system, but those fibers aren't maintained as much. So guess what happens to your skin? Right? It starts to sag, it starts to wrinkle, right? It starts to crease. It's because those fibers aren't being maintained like they used to be. And we'll look at how that happens. But that's what elastic fibers are. They allow that recoil. Reticular fibers, these are different. Reticular fibers hold organs together. They form a, I call them like a spider web network. So imagine an organ like your liver, for example. There's your liver. So your liver is made of billions of little liver cells in there, all doing their little liver job. And guess what? Among these liver cells is a spiderweb network of reticular fibers holding them all together. So reticular fibers are literally like a mesh network holding organs together. Your liver's held together by reticular fibers, your lungs are held together by reticular fibers, your spleen, your lymph nodes, it's a bunch of different organs held together by reticular fibers. So, there are some of the fibers. And now that we kind of understand what they are, you can recognize them. See this big, thick collagen, there we go, big, thick collagen fiber, some skinny, elastic fibers, and then these really skinny, kind of flimsy, spider web-like, those dark purple ones, reticular fibers, all in there giving structure to this extracellular matrix. And so all of our different types of connective tissue have a different percentage of these different types of fibers. So there is a disorder called Marfan Syndrome. And it's actually a disorder that affects your connective tissue, and specifically the elastic and collagen that's in your body. And so what ends up happening with individuals with Marfan syndrome is they're very flexible. They tend to be like double jointed. Have you ever seen these people that can like wrap their arms like around their neck and do all these weird, so that's, think Marfan syndrome, kind of thing like that. And people with Marfan syndrome, because all of this elastic fibers are underneath your skin, they can actually stretch their skin really far. I mean, if I pull on my cheeks, I can't go very far, right? It's because I'm so young and my skin's so tight. But if I had Marfan syndrome, I could pull it out even further, right? People with Marfan syndrome can do that. And so there's other things that can be kind of a side effect of individuals with Marfan syndrome. They can have actually issues with their aorta, that big red artery that comes off of the heart and can actually rupture because of that connective tissue isn't recoiling and holding it together like it should. People with Marfan syndrome tend to be very, very, very tall, very, very, very skinny, and have very long limbs because it's the collagen is also in your bones, and so their bones tend to grow very, very, very long. You'll see people with Marfan syndrome have very long, spindly fingers. One of the little tests for it is, it's called like the thumb test or something like that, where you take your thumb and when you fold your fingers over your thumb, if your thumb sticks out, right, it's kind of a, maybe you want to go get checked for Marfan syndrome. So I can't imagine my thumb sticking out. I guess I have short thumbs, but it seems like I have far to go. But anyways, that's Marfan syndrome. So let's talk about how cells stick together. These cell junctions apply mostly to our epithelial tissue, our covering, right? The matrix and the fibers, that applies to connective tissues because our connective tissues have cells and non-cells, right? Epithelial tissues are covering and lining, so they need to have special connections. They need to be layered on top of each other or stuck to each other like a brick wall. And so these junctions are going to help them do that. There's tight junctions, desmosomes, and gap junctions. So a tight junction, this is where the cells are literally packed together. Think like bricks and mortar, right? Think like the outside of this building. Nothing's getting through that sucker, right? You got bricks and then you have this mortar. So in other words, nothing can squeeze through the cells. Nothing can squeeze through that little crack in between them. If something needs to get through, it has to go through the cell membrane, through the cell, and out the cell membrane on the other side, if it needs to get through. That's the whole purpose of these tight junctions, not allowing stuff to squeeze through the cracks, right? If something needs to get through a tight junction, through to the other side of the cell, it has to go through the cell membrane, through the cell, and out the other side of the cell. So that's how a tight junction works. It's very, very tight. They're like zipped together. Something called a desmosome does the same idea, but it provides a little bit of flexibility. Desmosomes allow for a little bit of twisting and stretching. So a lot of our skin is actually held together by desmosomes. They can actually kind of twist and bend and move a little bit more than the tight junctions, which are more like a brick wall. So it's just a different type of filament. It's called an intermediate filament. It's part of the cytoskeleton of those cells, which help create this extra flexibility. And then desmosomes, gap junctions. Gap junctions are like little hallways in between the cells, right? Imagine that you live in a townhouse and you created a little trap door between your house and your neighbor's house so you can pass, sugar and eggs or beer or whatever back and forth, right? That would be kind of cool, actually. That's what a desmosome is. It's a little hole in between the cells so they can just pass things back and forth, right? It's for really effective communication. Because if you didn't have a desmosome or a gap junction there to allow for this communication, oh, there it is, nice and zoom in. If you didn't have a gap, there you go. If you didn't have a gap junction there to allow for that, the information would have to go outside the cell, over, and then inside to the neighbor, right? A gap junction is just going to allow it to go whoop, right next door, a little hallway. And so That's how our cells are held together, and that, again, mostly applies to epithelial tissue. So let's start knocking out some epithelial tissue and talking about it. We understand it's a protection, it's a covering, it's a lining, it's held together by special junctions, but we need to start classifying it. So it's mostly there for protection and immune defenses. It provides a physical barrier to prevent things from getting in, right? Because of those tight junctions, anything that's getting in through the body, past the epithelial tissue, has to go through the actual cell itself. You can't just squeeze on through. So, every internal body surface, every barrier, every membrane, all made of epithelial tissue. It's also there for secretion. Because it's a covering and a lining, think about what we were talking about with body temperature regulation, right? Our sweat glands release sweat onto the surface of the skin. Well, where do those sweat glands come from? The epithelial tissue. Guess what is secreted along your digestive system lining? Mucus, right? Your respiratory lining, more mucus, right? So our epithelial cells aren't just for covering and protecting, they also secrete, right? They also help to transport into other tissues. Like I said, stuff has to pass over them in order for substances to get into the body or out of the body. And they're also there for sensation. Because they're a covering and a lining, we can feel what things feel like, or taste, or smell, etc. because of the receptors in that tissue. So there's some specialized features of them. All right, one of the things that we're going to notice as we start to look at epithelial tissue is that our epithelial tissue is almost always this dark purple, pink color. So when we get in lab, we can all collectively groan together, but you're going to have to be able to identify all the types of tissue eventually for your first practical. We'll get there, I'll show you the tricks and everything. It's really not that bad. But I know at first, all of the types of tissue look the same. Again, it's like a new language. It's like the cell microscope language that doesn't make any sense, but it will make sense once we practice. So what we're looking at here is actually two different types of tissue. Up here, these big blobs, those big dark purple bubbles in them, those are the epithelial cells. Below, you see a scattering of dark purple and then all of this pink. That's a connective tissue, right? The fibers are those pink things, right? Think back to that like cartoon picture where the fibers look like, you know, sparsely spread apart and they were all color-coded and nice to look at. Yeah, that's what they really look like, right? So this would be a connective tissue, and this is our epithelial tissue. Whoops. Epithelial tissue is always on top of connective tissue, or to use some anatomy vocabulary, epithelial tissue is superficial to connective tissue. Connective tissue is deep to epithelial tissue. Right? In some cases that's reversed. If we're talking about the inside of an organ, then the connective tissue is actually superficial because it's inside the organ. But in general, you're always going to find them next to each other. So here, again, we see, this is actually the esophagus. So you see connective tissue down here and epithelial tissue on top. All right, skipping over this. Let's get into how our epithelial tissue is classified. You can just cross, those slides were just little extra things elaborating the same stuff we've talked about. Epithelial tissue has a top and a bottom. If I gave you a blood cell, blood is not a epithelial tissue, it's a connective tissue. But if I gave you a blood cell, there is no top, no bottom, no right, no left to it, right? A blood cell is a blood cell, whether it's upside down or right side up. Epithelial tissue is not like that. Epithelial tissue has a top and a bottom to it. It's called polarity. Polarity. And what that means is that there's literally an up and a down, a north and a south pole, so to speak. So when we look at this picture here, you see this label, apical, oh, there we go, I forgot I could zoom in. Apical surface. The apical surface is the exposed surface. That's what you see. So you're looking at my skin, you see the apical surface of my epithelial cells. You see that. You touch the insides of your cheeks, you're touching the apical surface of your cheek cells. The apical surface is the top. The basal surface, or sometimes it's referred to as the basolateral surface. It's all the same thing. If it's not apical, if it begins with a B, it's the bottom. That's the trick there. Sometimes it's called basolateral and sometimes it's called basal. It's the same thing, it's the bottom. So this is what's usually rooted in our connective tissue. When we look down here at our basal surface, this is what's planted or rooted in connective tissue. And they're connected through what's called a basement membrane. So it's literally like glue holding the epithelial tissue onto the connective tissue. So you'll have a cell. Here's the apical surface. Here's the basal surface. I'm literally just redrawing this, but I like to redraw things. You should like to too. It helps activate the other side of your brain if you feel like a little lost or you're drifting a little bit. This will bring you back. This is our basal surface. And below the basal surface is our basement membrane, which actually has 2 layers to it. A basement membrane has something called a basal lamina. And a reticular layer. Oops, I'll do this the other way. This whole thing makes up the basement membrane. And this is all connective tissue down here. So you can see why polarity is so important, right? You can't have this top part down here because this top part might have some special features on it. It might have cilia, it might have microvilli, it might have something special on it, some type of cell marker, that if you stuck it in the dirt, so to speak, down here, it's not going to be able to do its job. So epithelial cells have a right way up and an upside down.
So is the lamina part of the connective tissue?
Yeah, yep. Yeah, the lamina is part of the connective tissue. So the basal lamina and the reticular lamina, right? So these are the two parts of this basement membrane, right? They're both maintained between the epithelial layer and the connective tissue layer. The basal lamina is actually secreted by our epithelial cell, so it's kind of like secreting this substance down here to maintain it. The connective tissue secretes the reticular layer, or the reticular lamina, and so that creates this little like sandwich of stuff that sticks them together, holds them together. It's like a glue. So our epithelial tissue gets classified very, very simply. It gets classified by how many layers it has and by the shape of the cells. So what we've been talking about so far is general tissue. We haven't actually named anything specific. I haven't told you this is the type of tissue that's here or there or anywhere yet. Simple epithelial is the type that's just one cell thick. Stratified is many cells thick. Think about how good this would be at protecting and covering. Think about how good this would be at just maybe lining and maybe even allowing for something to pass through, right? Maybe like diffusion of something. Something needs to get from one side of the membrane to the other. It's just one cell thick. It's like a little piece of paper. See, I told you it's possessed. I did not touch it. Oh, there it is. That's the thing. It's happening again. So hopefully we can survive. They're also named by their shape. So there's 3 different shapes our epithelial cells can be. Squamous, get back here, squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. Squamous is squashed. Sometimes people say squamous. It doesn't matter how you say it, just know how to spell it, right? Cuboidal is cube-shaped, columnar is column-shaped. So when we combine the two forms of classification, you're going to end up with cells that are called simple squamous, stratified squamous, simple cuboidal, stratified cuboidal, simple columnar, stratified columnar, right? Because we're combining the number of layers with the shape to understand what tissue it is. And so because, remember, one of the big themes in anatomy is form and function, right? Structure and function. What something looks like is going to determine what it does, where it is, what it's covering, what it's lining. And so that's why this is so important to understand. So simple, stratified, and different shapes. Let's take a look at it. Simple epithelial can have microvilli. Microvilli are increased surface area. This is an example of microvilli. Microvilli is extensions of the cytoplasm, like extra little fingers going up. Cilia is something else. Cilia is like hairs. Have you ever watched a millipede like walk? How its legs kind of move in like a wave? Or have you ever watched like one of those videos of like seagrass like all flowing? That's how cilia move. The cilia are just like little hairs, little pieces of grass, little legs on top of the cells that allow stuff to move across the cell surface. So simple epithelial can have microvilli, or can have cilia, or can have nothing. It's not going to have microvilli and cilia because they have two different purposes, right? But it will have one or the other, or nothing at all. And that's because of structure and function, right? So something that has microvilli is going to have that because it needs extra surface area. It's going to be really good at absorbing things. Something that has cilia is going to be really good about moving something across its surface, right? And so we'll look at where these things are. There we go. Simple squamous. So I'm going to erase these and we'll kind of start our little graphic organizer here and hope to be able to finish at least this one today. This is going to be really big for those of you that like to do this with me, so think aloud and maybe turn your page landscape. So simple squamous. This is one cell thick, thin cells. One cell layer of very, very thin cells. So this is really good for diffusion. It's great for diffusion. Getting something across the membrane, getting something from maybe the outside of a space to the inside of a space, because it's just one cell layer thick. This is found in the lungs and in our blood vessels. I abbreviate blood vessels BVs. BVs. Do you know what I mean by blood vessels? Arteries, veins, capillaries, anything that where our blood is transported. It's all lined with simple squamous. So think about our lungs. Our lungs are lined with simple squamous. That's because air comes in. These simple squamous cells need to pick the oxygen out. It does it by a gradient. We talked about gradients recently. That oxygen gradient is going to pull oxygen into the lung cells, push it into the blood, pull carbon dioxide out of the blood, push it into the air, and then we exhale it. So simple squamous is there for diffusion. It's just this light, thin little membrane. Simple cuboidal. These are good for absorption and secretion. These are found in kidney tubules. So, let me back up for a minute. Absorption means what? If this is our kidney, our simple cuboidal kidney cells, and this is the inside of tubule, and this is the outside of a tubule. What's absorption? Yeah, bringing in, right? Absorption is bringing stuff in to the tubule, and then secretion is going to be what? The opposite, getting stuff out of the tubule. So in other words, these cuboidal cells are good for doing both. They're good for pulling stuff in and getting stuff out. Pulling stuff in and getting stuff out. They're kind of the right depth for that. If they were too thin, if they were squamous, that stuff would move so quickly because those cells are so thin that your body would almost lose control of the filtering process that goes on in the kidneys. So the cuboidal cells are perfect because they're just thick enough to slow the process down to allow for this exchange to take place. So renal tubules or kidney tubules, that's the main location of these. Simple columnar. So again, simple means one cell layer, and then the following word just is describing the cell shape. So this is one cell layer thick of column-shaped cells. These will often have microvilli. Remember what we said microvilli do? They increase absorption. They increase surface area for increased absorption, which means these simple columnar cells are great for absorption. In other words, it's a unidirectional movement. It's just stuff into the cell. It's not filtering other stuff out. It's only pulling in. These are found in the intestines. There's some parts of our respiratory tract, but for the most part, our intestines have simple columnar. Again, looking at these micrographs, you see column-shaped cells. Now, you might not be able to tell that it's an actual column, but the giveaway is, if I can zoom in, will it let me? The giveaway are these dark purple, there we go, dark purple circles. Those dark purple circles are the nuclei. So you see these nuclei right next to each other. Each nuclei is its own individual cell, right? Because cells only have one nucleus. There's some exceptions to that. We'll talk about it later, but that's the gist of it. There's also something called pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. That prefix pseudo means kind of, sort of. So it's kind of, sort of stratified. In other words, it's not actually stratified. Just check out the time. 4 minutes. Cool. So if you look at the nuclei here, it almost looks like there's several layers of cells, but they're not. Are we 620 or 625? 620. Oh, so we're technically over. Okay. I was thinking 25. I'll stop. It looks like it's several layers, but it's just one. And that's what makes it pseudo-stratified. It's ciliated because it has cilia, and it's found in the lungs. I'll add it. This is where we'll stop. Still getting used to my class time, sorry. Lungs, it has cilia. And the reason it has cilia is to move substances across. That's what cilia does. Our lungs trap debris that we breathe in, and the cilia move up that stuff into the back of our throat, and we swallow it most of the time. We don't even know that we swallowed it. Sometimes you feel it, you go, right? That's that. That's because of the cilia in your respiratory tract. So we'll stop there. We'll do stratified on Thursday and connective tissue and all of that. Proximal and distal are That's fine. Yeah, proximal would be like the shoulder is proximal to the elbow. Right? We were talking about our arms, legs, medial lateral.
Medial, I guess medial.
Yeah. Above. Yep. All right.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. 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 I can, yes, so I can save a copy for you, that we have it. Yeah. No problem. Yes? Yep.
I'm really confused on which resources. Someone just on my medial.
That's what we were, so proximal and distal are for your arms and legs, right? So you would say the shoulder is proximal to the elbow, right? But you wouldn't say that's medial, because it's still, when you're talking about the core of the body, that's medial and lateral. Yeah.
So anything in your arms.
Exactly, so torso, head, neck, medial, lateral, arms and legs, proximal, distal.
Thank you.
Yeah?
But,
This is a course for yes.
I have a question. For the labs, is it just the worksheet you or the entire?
The 2 case studies.
Oh, just the case study?
Yep, case study 1, case study 2.
Okay.
Yep.
How in depth do you want your, like, the case studies? Like,
So
you want a couple
I'm not,
sentences? You want?
no, so I just want answers.
Okay.
Yeah, if this were like a 100 level class, I'd have you make like paragraphs and stuff, but I assume you guys know how to write, so, yeah.
Okay.